Very good to be back in Lake Charles and to see all of you once again. My family and I arrived here yesterday evening. I had an opportunity to visit with Mr. Doucette and Mr. Doucette last night. Very encouraging to look and see the changes and the continued improvement that he's shown. I'm sure that all of you have been continuing to pray about it, and certainly God is in the meeting. We can all be very thankful for that. Look forward to seeing him back here in the harness again, as I'm sure God will enable him to do in a matter of weeks. We are, at this time of the year, approaching the spring festival season. The announcement made during the announcement portion regarding the Passover. We're approaching the time of the Passover, the time of the days of unleavened bread, which of course will be, as you customarily done here in this area, a combined service, Lake Charles and Beaumont here in this hall. And in fact, I look forward to being over here with you on the first holy day of unleavened bread. On the last holy day of unleavened bread, you're going to be having a special guest from Pasadena, Mr. Greg Albrecht, who is a pastor-ranked minister and the dean of students at Pastor College of Pasadena, is going to be here for the final holy day. So, you, of course, look forward to that, and we should. We begin to anticipate the spring festival season, God's festivals. I think that it is important, as we approach the festival season, to go back and to reflect on certain things that relate very directly to the festivals. Now, when God created mankind, God created the Sabbath. We're told in the book of Mark that the Sabbath was made for man. And God made the Sabbath when He made man. Back in the beginning, you can go back and read Genesis chapters 1 and 2. You find, of course, the first 6 days of creation, Adam and Eve having been created late on Friday afternoon. And then God rested on the Sabbath and hallowed it and set it apart. Now, at that particular point in time, you do not read anything concerning the holy days or the festivals. As you go through and read the book of Genesis, we find the Sabbath in existence. There is, however, no mention of the festivals or the holy days. Now, we need to understand a particular event that transpired that represented a difference in the way that God had dealt with man. In the beginning, God dealt with Adam and Eve as individuals. God dealt with a certain individual. God dealt later with Abel. God dealt with Cain, and of course dealt with him finally in a negative way because of Cain's attitude. God dealt with Abel. God dealt with Enoch. We're told that Enoch walked with God. God dealt with Noah. After the flood, we find that God called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees and told him to go to a land that he would afterward give him. In fact, a land that he would afterward show him, because when Abram left, he did not know where he was going. God said go, and he got up and went. God dealt with Isaac as an individual. God dealt with Jacob as an individual. God dealt with Joseph as an individual. We find as we go through the story of Genesis, God dealing with individuals. Now, as we begin the book of Exodus, we find that God began dealing with another individual, a man by the name of Moses. However, God dealt with him in a special way. God raised Moses up for a specific job to go back and to lead the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Now you see Jacob's family, Jacob is one individual whom God had dealt, had gone down into Egypt with his family, and over a period of several generations, the family had multiplied tremendously. Now, Jacob's children had grown great to a nation of multiple hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. Now, God dealt with Moses and told Moses, I want you to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. Now that represented a change in the way that God dealt with man. Because you see, from that point forward, God began to deal not just with an isolated individual over here and an isolated individual over there. From that time forward, God began to deal with a group of people, a congregation, as it were. A congregation or a church. Ancient Israel is called, back in Acts chapter 7, the church in the wilderness. They're called the congregation of Israel. So God now began to deal with the church. If you want to read the beginning of the church, you go back and you read the first few chapters of Exodus, particularly around Exodus chapter 12, when God called Israel out of Egypt. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 10, we read an interesting statement. There arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Eternal knew face to face. Now, God had up until the time of Moses dealt with individuals. And he had dealt with them on a face-to-face basis. He talked with Adam in the garden. He evidently talked directly with Cain and Abel. He walked with Enoch. He dealt directly with Noah, with Abraham. You read that he came and dined with Abraham. If you go back to the book of Genesis, about chapter 18, 17, 18, right in there where Christ and two angels appeared to Abraham on the plains of Mamre, came and sat down and ate a meal with them. And there was a personal dealing. Wrestled with Jacob. Dealt with mankind on a personal basis. And he dealt with Moses that way. We're told in another place that he dealt with Moses face to face as a man with his friend. Now we're told here in Deuteronomy 34:10 that since that time, God has not dealt with man that way. Now there is a reason for that. God had up until beginning here at the time of Moses dealt only with singular individuals. Now, did Abraham study the Bible? Well, how much time did Abraham spend studying his Bible? He didn't spend any time studying his Bible because there wasn't a Bible to study. How much time did Joseph spend or did Moses spend studying the Bible? He didn't spend any time because there wasn't a Bible to study, but the beginnings of the Bible were written by Moses, the first 5 books. You see, up until that time, God had only dealt with an individual. He had dealt with individuals and had personally instructed them. Now, at this particular point in time, God called out a church. He called out a congregation. Now, when God ceased to deal just with one individual out of a generation and began to deal with a group, a church, a congregation, there were certain alterations that God made. One of the first of which was the need for written scriptures, out of which the group might be instructed. Because you see, when God was dealing with a group, there had to be organization, because God is not the author of confusion. When God is dealing with one individual and that individual alone, the organization is, God is here and you're here. And that's all the organization is needed because you've got, God and an individual. And God personally instructed the individual. Now God began to call out a group, so the first thing God did was He organized. There was an organizational pattern that was set up. There were those in the group that were set over others in the group to instruct them. And then there had to be a basis of instruction. And so God revealed the law to Moses, which is the basis of the revelation on which the rest of the Bible is built. God began the authorship of Scripture through Moses. And as God began to deal with the congregation, God began something else. It was at the time that God began the church that He instituted the festivals, that He instituted the holy days. We can read in the book of Exodus. Let's turn back there. Notice In Exodus chapter 12 and verse 1, "And the Eternal spoke unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year unto you." Now here was another change. The change was actually being made in the calendar. God was going to now begin the calendar starting in the spring. Prior to that time, the year had begun in the autumn, or in the fall. You will notice, if you look at a calendar, many times in the fall, at the time, on the date of the Feast of Trumpets, you will notice the words written on there on many secular calendars, Rosh Hashanah. Written on the date of the Feast of Trumpets. That's the Hebrew term. That is also commonly known as Jewish New Year. Now, you never find that statement or that terminology used in the Scriptures. But that is another name. That is what is commonly known as among the Jews. And that is a preservation of the original beginning of the year. There are several ways that we realize this. Of course, in Exodus 12, we have the beginning of the way that the sacred year is figured now. We begin the year in the spring, because God began to instruct concerning the beginning of His festivals. It's obvious to understand why God began originally the year in the fall. God created the creation full and mature. God had started the creation set in the spring. What would Adam have had to eat? He would have had orange blossoms and apple blossoms, and everything would have been blossoming out and flowering. Adam would have gone a few months before anything reached the time for harvest. He would have gotten rather hungry in the course of 4 or 5 months, whatever it would take. So God began the creation in the fall, where everything, the trees were laden with fruit, and the fruit was ripe. So that all Adam had to do was pick it off and eat. Now, there's only one tree that we weren't supposed to eat of, and that was the one he wanted. Of course, we're never that way today, are we? We never have a desire. It's one thing we're not supposed to have. But, so God had begun in the fall, and this had been the pattern that had been preserved. Now God began to make an alteration, and the reason He did was for a specific reason. He said, "Now, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year. Speak you unto all the congregation of Israel, the church of Israel, saying, in the 10th day of this month, they shall take every man a lamb according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house." And He began to give them instruction. In verse 6, they were to keep it up until the 14th day of the same month. "And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening, or between the two evenings." Technically, that referred to the time between sunset and dusk, or the sunset and total darkness, the time we know as dusk. That was the time that Passover was to be observed. That's the time, of course, that we observe it today. And then they were told they were to eat it. Verse 11, last part of the verse, "It is the Eternal's Passover." And then, coming on down in verse 15, 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. Verse 16, "In the first day there shall be a holy convocation. And in the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation." So God began to institute the festivals. When God instituted the church, He instituted the festivals. God's Sabbath was given for man. It was given when man was made, and it shows God's plan for dealing with man. 6,000 years are allotted to mankind, just as the first 6 days of the week are allotted to us as individuals. The 7th 1,000-year period is reserved for God, just as an individual, the 7th day of the week is reserved for God in our individual lives. So God gave the Sabbath to man when man was made to demonstrate or to show man His plan for mankind. Now, when God established the church, He established the festivals. The festivals were made for the church when the church was made, and they were established to show God's plan and pattern for the church. Now, ultimately, all mankind will be called into the church. But the festivals show God's dealing with the church. And it begins with the Passover, with the time that God course, you'll have more detailed sermons on that, and I don't want to get too much into some of the specifics on each of those days, and particularly on the Passover today, because there will be other sermons between now and then, and certainly on the festival days during the days of unleavened bread. But here in ancient Egypt, they put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, and the death angel then passed over them, and they were exempted from death because the blood of the lamb was on their doorpost. Now we're told that Jesus Christ is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. We're told back in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. So, we have the beginning of God's plan, followed by the days of unleavened bread, during which, of course, we're to put leavening out of our lives. Leavening typifies that, and just as leavening physically puffs up, it typifies that which spiritually puffs up, typifies sin, showing that after we accept the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, we have to go on from there to put sin out of our lives as individuals and as a group to come out of spiritual Egypt. You know, there are two aspects to the days of unleavened bread. Certain things you were to do as individuals, certain things you were to do as a group. If the Israelites as individuals were to put the leavening out of their home, as individuals they were to take in of unleavened bread. As a group, they had to make a journey from Egypt outward. Now, we as individuals have to put sin out of our lives, and as a group, we are coming collectively out of sin, out of this society. Alright, we proceed on, and as you go through the books of the law, you're introduced to the other festival seasons in their particular season. As Israel arrived at Mount Sinai on just prior to the day of Pentecost, we find very clearly stated they arrived there in Exodus chapter 19 on the first week of the third month, which is the week in which Pentecost always comes. And then there were a matter of several days as they went on to then receive the Ten Commandments to enter into the covenant with God. And Israel entered into a covenant with God. The basis of the covenant was that Israel told God, all that the Eternal has said, we will do. So Israel entered into a special relationship with God. A special covenant relationship. God was to be in the role of the husband, the protector, the provider. Israel was to be in the role of the wife. They were to be faithful. They were to obey God. Now Israel did not continue in the covenant they made with God. If you remember the story, Exodus chapter 19, Israel came there to Mount Sinai. The Eternal proposed to Moses, who in turn proposed to the elders of the people, that God says, look, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, brought you unto myself. If you will continue in my word, if you will obey my voice indeed, I will be to you a God, and you shall be to me a people. And if you will walk in my ways, I will bless you. And Israel said, all that the Eternal has said we will do. And so then they were instructed to prepare themselves, to sanctify themselves, come and gather around the mount, and then in Exodus chapter 20, God spoke the words of the Ten Commandments, which were the basis of the covenant. The people were frightened, and they said, don't let God speak to us again. We're afraid of God. And so then Moses proceeded through Exodus chapter 21, 22, and 23 to speak to them the statutes and the judgments, which were, here's what the statutes that Moses gave them were. It was the amplification of the principles of the Ten Commandments to apply to a physical, carnal people, a physical, carnal nation. It was the amplification of those principles as it applied to them as a physical nation. Now we find in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 the amplification of the Ten Commandments as they apply to us as a spiritual people. Matthew 5, 6, and 7 answer to Exodus 21, 22, and 23. The beginning of the Old Covenant, the beginning of the New Covenant. 3 chapters of statutes that amplify the principles of the Ten Commandments. One for a physical people, the other for a spiritual people. Alright, after Moses had given the statutes to Israel, he went up
up into Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments on the tables of stone and to receive further detailed instructions from God. Now, as we proceed through chapter 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, we find God instructing Moses in the mountain. And we also find something else going on, because as we get into Exodus chapter 32, we find that there had been a little bit of trouble brewing down below. In fact, we find that the people said, as for this man Moses, we don't know what happened to him. Perhaps he climbed up the mountain and had a heart attack or something. We don't know. He's gone way off somewhere. Now, he was gone for a period altogether of 40 days. 40 God uses in the scripture as a number of trial and testing. Israel was tried and tested after they had accepted the old covenant. And they did not last 6 weeks. Because we find in Exodus chapter 32, when they saw that Moses delayed to come down, in other words, God was not operating on their time schedule. You see, there are those who have gone out from us today because God was not operating and is not operating on their time schedule. They took the same attitude that the Pharisees took when Christ rebuked the Pharisees and he said, look, you're like little children playing your flute in the marketplace. And you say, we played and you haven't danced. In other words, you haven't danced to our tune. You haven't conformed to what we wanted you to do. There are those that have gone out from the church of God because God has not danced to their tune. God has not operated on their time schedule. Christ did not come back at the time they thought he should. And so they found themselves fulfilling the prophecy that is given. That if that servant shall say, my Lord delays his coming, and begins to smite his fellow servants, and eat and drink with the drunk, his Lord shall come in such a day that he thinks not, and cut him asunder, and give him his portion with the hypocrites. Now you can go back to some Christ specific statements on that back in Matthew 24. And rather precarious to think that God is going to operate on our time schedule. Well, Moses did not operate on their time schedule. You see, people get it mixed up. God doesn't answer to us, we answer to him. God doesn't conform to us, we have to conform to him. God has a time schedule and God calls the shots. We don't. So we simply seek to conform to what God says. All right, the people decided that Moses wasn't going to come down, so they decided that they would institute their own brand of religion. They made a golden calf. And, sure enough, the matter came to Moses' attention. Now, Moses came on down the mountain. I think it's rather interesting. Let's just notice one or two things here in Exodus 32. That when they came down the mountain in Exodus 32, chapter 7, 32nd chapter, verse 17, as Moses and Joshua were coming down the mountain, remember they hadn't seen what was going on yet. God had simply told Moses what was going on. Moses didn't think it was that bad until he got down there and saw it. In verse 17, when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said unto Moses, there's the noise of the war and the king. They were coming down the mountain, and Joshua said, I think they've been invaded. There's a war going on down there. Listen to all that noise. People are dying. People are being killed. In verse 18, he said, it's not the voice of them that shout for mastery, neither is it the voice of them that cry for being overcome, but the noise of them that sing do I hear. They were having a real rock fest. That's what they were having. They never played Brahms' lullaby down there. Joshua coming down the camp, he said, I think there's a war going on down there. It sounds like somebody getting killed. He came on down a little further. He says, no, they're not getting killed. They're out there. They're dancing. It's the voice of them that sing. So he came on down, verse 19, came fast. As they came nigh the camp, they saw the camp and the dancing. Boy, they were having a real rock fest. They were really blaring out. And Moses' anger waxed hot. Moses got just a little bit upset. In fact, that's just stating it very mildly. And you remember the story, he cast the table of stone down, demonstrating, just as the tables of the covenant were shattered, the people had broken which they did. Then Moses had to turn around and go back up the mountain to get another set of the tables of stone, receive further instruction. Then we come to the book of Leviticus, where the sacrificial system is instituted. You see, God tells us in Jeremiah 7 that in the day that He brought Israel out of Egypt, He did not originally speak to them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. Jeremiah 7:22. But this thing I said unto them, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people. But they continued not in God's covenant. They didn't hearken. They didn't obey. God added the sacrifices. It was a law that was added afterward because of their disobedience to the Ten Commandments. They had broken the covenant. They were having a real orgy, a real blast down there. Here they set up an idol. It mentioned some of the people were naked. A real orgy was going on. They had totally broken the covenant. All right. We go on through the rest of the story of the Old Covenant. And what we see is a period of ups and downs. Now, one of the things that I want to call to your attention is the role that God's festivals play in the life of the people. God instituted the festivals when He instituted the church. Now, what we find as we read the story of the Old Testament church was that it was constantly going astray and departing from the way of God. We find that God continually through that period raised up His prophet to go and warn the people and to stir them up, to remind them of the covenant that they had made, and to see if they would hearken, if they would repent and return. One of the things that we notice as we go through is that every time there was a revival among the people, a restoration of the law, and the people began to turn from their evil ways and to obey God, one of the things that was in the forefront, and that was the beginning of their revival and the restoration of the truth of God among them, was the matter of the holy days. Was the matter of the festivals. When God instituted the physical temple, the beginning of the physical temple, we find when the temple was consecrated. When was it dedicated? In 2 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 1, thus all the work that Solomon made for the house of the eternal was finished, and Solomon brought in all the things that David his father had dedicated, and the silver and the gold and all the instruments, put he among the treasures of the house of God. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes and the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel unto Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the covenant of the eternal out of the city of David, which is Zion. Wherefore all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto the king in the feast, which was in the 7th month. Now what is the feast in the 7th month? Well, we all certainly ought to be familiar with that. We normally go to Big Sandy or to perhaps other locations. It is, of course, the Feast of Tabernacles. It comes on the 15th day of the 7th month. So all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto the king in the feast, which is in the 7th month. And all the elders of Israel came, and the Levites took up the ark. And so they came in there. Verse 6, and King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel that were assembled unto him before the ark, and they went through and they did all their various, they offered the sacrifices. God went through and reiterated His covenant with Solomon, which He had made originally with David. And in chapter 7, verse 1, when Solomon had made an end of praying, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices, and the glory of the eternal filled the house. And the priests could not enter into the house of the eternal because the glory of the eternal had filled the eternal's house. And so they offered sacrifices in chapter 8, or in verse 8 rather, chapter 7. Also at the same time, Solomon kept the feast 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great congregation from the entering of Hamath unto the river of Egypt. So, way up in the northern reaches, all the way down to the Nile River, Solomon's kingdom was greatly expanded. And in the 8th day, they made a solemn assembly. So they kept the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days, and then the 8th day was a holy convocation, the last great day, just as we do today. God instructed in Leviticus 23. They kept the dedication of the altar 7 days and the feast 7 days. And so then, on the 23rd day of the 7th month, which is the day after the last great day, the Feast of Tabernacles runs from the 15th day through the 21st day, the 7th month. The last great day is on the 22nd of the 7th month, and then on the 23rd day, in other words, the day after the feast, he sent them away. And glad and merry in heart for the goodness that the Eternal showed unto David and Solomon to Israel his people. So, we find a high point in the history of Israel as they had come together to observe the dedication of the house of God. And it was in conjunction with the Feast of Tabernacles. And it represented, and of course, as you go through the story, you find that God had instructed that all the Feast of Tabernacles, the people were to assemble themselves together, and that particularly, every 7 years there was a specific thing, and this came on one of those sabbatical years. In Deuteronomy 31, verses 10 and 11, Moses had commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, in the solemnity of the year of release, in the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel has come to appear before the Eternal your God, in the place which he shall choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men, women, and children, and your stranger that is within your gate, that they may hear, that they may learn, and fear the Eternal your God, and observe to do all the words of this law. So they went through, every 7 years, they had a special ceremony. You see, you had other people coming of age, you see. Every 7 years you had a new group that was reaching a level of maturity, that they went through and spent the entire festival reading the first 5 books of the Bible. And they read the whole thing through. There were other matters that would be covered in the other festivals, but this was a time when everyone was there together and they went through the whole thing. Now, this was, of course, at this time, in 2 Chronicles chapter 7. And it was a high point. Now, what happened afterward? Israel began to drift. They began to drift away from obeying God and from serving God and keeping His commandments. Solomon began to compromise with the law of God and actually turn away from his obedience. And so at Solomon's death, the kingdom was rent from his son. And Rehoboam was left with only the tribe of Judah and a little bit of Benjamin and Levi, while Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had been a servant of Solomon, actually inherited or actually came to power in the northern 10 tribes. And so northern Israel, the house of Israel, broke away from the throne of David. And we find, then, that Jeroboam instituted a new religion in Israel. In 1 Kings chapter 12 and verse 28, whereupon the king took counsel. You see, you can take counsel. That does not say the king took wise counsel. Sometimes people seek counsel, but they seek the counsel that they want. They cast them out. You know, we had an incident come up in Houston back several weeks ago that came to my attention, a particular member that had counseled with another minister, and then he had counseled with me, and he had received some counsel that he did not want to hear. So then he decided he needed to counsel a little further, so he called up a particular member who had the same problem that he wanted to have, and asked this particular member for advice, hoping that he would hear now what he wants, see? So, he's since been dealt with appropriately, but the point is, you can seek counsel and not seek wise counsel. Alright, the king took counsel. But if you read earlier in the chapter, you find he had run off those that had given him, he was seeking counsel of people that would agree with it. And he made 2 calves of gold. And said unto them, it's too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel. It's too hard for you to have to go down there and do what God says. It's too hard for you to have to make this long journey down to Jerusalem to observe the festival. Oh, that's too difficult. What we need is a religion of convenience. What we need is an easy religion. Something you can be comfortable with. So I tell you what, we'll have 2. We'll have one up in the north and one in the south, and that way everybody will have a place that's convenient to him. And so he set up the golden calf, one at Bethel, the other at Dan. And verse 31, made a house of high places, and made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. So he sought out people who were just hunting for a job that were not particularly trained in God's way at all. Rather, they were individuals who would preach whatever Jeroboam told them to preach, so they could pay them. And let's notice what he did in verse 32. Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, right unto the feast that is in June. So what did he do? The first thing that he did was to get away from the festivals of God. He instituted a feast in the 8th month. Now, rather interesting story. In fact, we observe in this nation the remnant of Jeroboam's feast in the 8th month to this very day. Perhaps you don't realize that, but that's where Halloween actually comes from. We inherited in this country. It goes back to the Druids, the Celts in ancient Europe, who were the ancient Israelites that had migrated up into Europe. Our ancestors, the Druids, which were particularly the religious teachers, the Celts. And you'll notice, it normally comes about like that with the Tabernacle. And it is a time that talks about, all time when the dead come up and all the various pagan superstitions that are mixed in with it. It comes in October. What does the word October mean? It means 8th month. Now, today we observe our month a little differently. The ancient month of October has begun a couple of weeks later than ours does, and therefore, but it's still preserved. It's interesting, it's just the remnant of this particular pagan custom that Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, instituted. A replacement for God's festivals. So he turned away from the festivals of God and the truth of God. Now, as we go down through the history of northern Israel, we find that they never again turned back to the religion of God. Over a period of approximately 200 years, because from the time that Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, set up an independent Israel, the time that Israel broke away from being under the house of David, until the Assyrian invasion was just over 200 years. Kind of interesting in light of the history of our nation and what we're finding, the parallel that we're seeing develop. Now, as we proceed on, let's go back to the book of 2 Chronicles again. As we come down to the time period when Israel was going to be taken into captivity. Northern Israel was going to be invaded. Judah had turned away from God. Israel was even further away from God. We find that there was a king who came to power in Judah. He's recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, a man by the name of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was 25 years old when he began to reign. 2 Chronicles 29:1. In verse 2, he did that which was right in the sight of the Eternal, according to all that David his father had done. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Eternal and repaired them, and brought in the priests and the Levites and gathered them together into the east court. And he said unto them, Hear me, you Levites, sanctify now yourselves, and sanctify the house of the eternal God of your fathers, and carry forth the filthiness out of this place. So the very first thing that they did was to begin to clean up the temple of God. Now the temple of God at this time was a physical temple. We're going to notice as we go on through the particular time period in which this was set. It was set right prior to the Passover. So Hezekiah gathered the people together. When Hezekiah came to power, he opened up the temple because it had been closed earlier. The Levites and the priests had been dispersed. So we find in verse 16, the priests went into the inner part of the house of the Eternal to cleanse it. And they brought out all the uncleanness that they found in the temple of the Eternal and the court of the house of the Eternal. And the Levites took it to carry it out abroad into the brook Kidron. And they began on the first day of the first month to sanctify. Now, the first day of the first month. Now, that was, of course, 2 weeks prior to the Passover. That's when they began to clean up the temple of God. We find that they began then to go through the various, down in verse 20, Hezekiah the king rose early and gathered the rulers of the city went up to the house of the Eternal. They brought 7 bullocks and 7 rams and 7 lambs and 7 he-goats for a sin offering for the kingdom and for the sanctuary and for Judah. And he commanded the priests and sons of Aaron to offer them on the altar of the Eternal. In verse 25, he set the Levites in the house of the Eternal with cymbals, psalteries, harps, according to the commandment of David, and of Gad, the king's seer, and Nathan the prophet, for so was the commandment of the Eternal by his prophets. So he instituted that they began singing the psalms. He organized the Levitical choir there, according to the instructions David had originally established. In verse 30, Hezekiah the king and princes commanded the Levites to sing praise unto the Eternal with the words of David, that's with the Psalms, and Asaph the seer. You go back and look, many of the Psalms are written for Asaph. And they sang praises with gladness, and they bowed their heads in worship. So it was a reinstitution of the worship of God. Now let's notice what happened. Chapter 30, verse 1. Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah, and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh, that they should come to the house of the Eternal at Jerusalem to keep the Passover unto the Eternal God of Israel. Now here is a very significant point. The Assyrian armies were poised to invade northern Israel. The Assyrian armies were ready to pour into northern Israel. Judah and Israel had been separate nations for 200 years. Israel had not come to Jerusalem to worship God on his true festivals for 200 years, except for an isolated individual here or there. Now, right prior to the Assyrian invasion, to the destruction of northern Israel as a nation, the transportation of Israel into captivity, here was Hezekiah, king of Judah, in Jerusalem, sending emissaries to another nation. To a foreign nation. Because Israel and Judah were 2 different nations, just as the United States and Britain are 2 different nations. And he sent his emissaries there, telling the people, come to Jerusalem and observe the Passover. And of course they had not done that for 200 years. Well, the king had taken counsel. Now we find again a king had taken counsel. But Hezekiah was a little more selective. See, he counseled with God's ministry. He counseled with the prophet Isaiah. He counseled with those that were in a position to give wise counsel. And his princes. And all the congregation in Jerusalem to keep the Passover in the 2nd month. Now they observed the 2nd Passover that allowance is made for back in the book of Numbers. If you remember in the book of Numbers, that there is a specific, in Numbers chapter 9, there is a specific allowance made for the observance of a 2nd Passover for those who were unable to keep the first. Now, it was not because it was inconvenient, it was a matter that an individual was ceremonially unclean. They were not able to come into the place to observe it. Of course, we have today, from time to time, an individual has to take the 2nd Passover. Perhaps they were sick and unable to appear before God, and so there is a specific date that's set for the 2nd Passover. Israel and Judah were ceremonially unclean. They had started the cleaning of the temple on the first day of the first month. There was not time to purify the priest. Neither had the people gathered themselves together to Jerusalem. But they pleased the king and all the congregation. So they established a decree to make proclamation throughout all Israel, from Beersheba even to Dan, that they should come to keep the Passover under the Eternal God of Israel at Jerusalem, for they had not done it of a long time in such sort as it was written. It had been a long time since they had done it. In fact, we're going to see in just a few verses how long it had been since they had observed the festivals as a nation. As representatives of all of Israel assembling at Jerusalem. Verse 6, so the post went with the letters from the king and his princes throughout all Israel and Judah, and according to the commandment of the king, saying, the children of Israel turn again unto the eternal God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, and he will return to the remnant of you that are escaped out of the hand of the kings of Assyria. The Syrian invasion had already begun. And some of Israel had already been transported. And it was a progressive thing. It took place over a period of years where the Assyrians were taking the Israelites and deporting them out. And so Hezekiah sent emissaries that preached repentance throughout things in your own days, in your own religious customs, and you come before God at the place that He has chosen, at the time that He has chosen, and appear before Him. And verse 7, be not like your fathers and like your brethren, which trespassed against the eternal God of their fathers, who therefore gave them up to desolation as you see. Verse 10, so the post passed from city to city through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, even unto Zebulun, but they laughed and scorned and mocked them. So northern Israel, just as northern Israel does today, our people Israel do. They laugh and they mock at the idea of observing God's festivals, at the idea of actually observing the time that God had made holy, because in northern Israel they were observing pagan festivals. They were observing Sunday rather than Sabbath, the 8th day rather than the 7th, just as they were observing the festival in the 8th month rather than the 7th. They had changed the date of God's festivals. They were observing Ishtar, Easter. You can read back in Ezekiel where the account of the elders of Israel, the children of Israel, actually worshiping the sun as it rose in the east. They're weeping for camels, which was the term for wind. Well, that's actually what it refers to as pagan custom, 40 days of abstinence preceding Ishtar, or Star, same as we have today. We can read the account back in Ezekiel. So, they were observing the wrong days. And when the message of God's servant came through the land, they laughed, they mocked. Verse 11, nevertheless, diverse or different ones, a handful of Asher and Manasseh and Zebulun, humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. So there were a handful, particularly of the tribes of Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun, that did come to Jerusalem. That's why it's kind of an interesting statement. If you notice, let's just hold your place there. We're going to be coming back to just a little inset. Notice in Luke chapter 2. Perhaps you remember the story. Maybe you have wondered where this particular lady came from. Luke chapter 2, verse 36. Now here's right after Christ was born and he was taken into the temple to be presented there in accordance with the law, a little infant. And his parents were there with him. And in Luke 2:36 we read, there was one Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was of a great age and had lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity, and she was a widow of about 84 years. So she had actually been widowed for 84 years. She was a very elderly lady. She'd been married for 7 years. Her husband died. So you figure, she was approximately 20 when she was married. She'd be 27 when she became a widow, and now she lived as a widow for 84 years. So she was obviously in excess of 100 years old, probably 110, 112, 115, something like that. A very elderly lady. And she, we're told, was of the tribe of Asher. And she did not depart from the temple. She actually lived there in a little room that adjoined the temple and served God with fastings and prayers night and day. And she came and, verse 38, coming in that instant, gave thanks likewise unto the Eternal and spoke to him of all them that looked for redemption in Jerusalem. So she actually pointed out those that were there, that this was the Messiah. God had allowed her to live and to see the Messiah. There's another account there of an elderly man that God had allowed the same privilege. Now, she was, you read that account and you know that Judah and Israel are separate. And here was Judah there, and Christ came to the Jews. And the Jews were living there in the land of Judea and in Jerusalem. And here you read of this lady that was of the tribe of Asher. How in the world did she get down there? Well, undoubtedly, one of her forebearers had been one of this handful of people. Because back in 2 Chronicles 30, it mentions specifically that there were a few from the tribe of Asher. So this is where undoubtedly one of her forebearers had been in that group that had not gone into the captivity, rather had come down to Jerusalem to observe Passover. So verse 12 of 2 Chronicles 30, also in Jerusalem the hand of God was to give them one heart to do the commandment of the king and the princes and of the word of the Lord. So they assembled in Jerusalem much people to keep the feast of unleavened bread, the sacrament, a very great congregation. And we go on through. And it gives the account. And verse 25, all the congregation of Judah with the priests and the Levites and all the congregation that came out of Israel, the strangers that came out of the land of Israel, and that dwelt in Judah rejoiced. So there was great joy, this is verse 26, there was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there was not the like in Jerusalem. Since the days of Solomon, 200 years earlier, there had not been the like, where representatives of all of the 12 tribes were gathered in Jerusalem to observe God's festivals. Now, there had been times when some of the Jews had observed it in Jerusalem. Now, as we continue right on down, that was only the beginning. Chapter 31, all Israel that were present went out to the cities of Judah, broke down the images in pieces, cut down the groves, threw down the high places and the altars out of all of Judah and Benjamin, in Ephraim also. So they even spread up in northern Israel and started destroying some of the idols up there. Until they had utterly destroyed them all. Now, continuing on down in verse 4, moreover, he commanded the people that dwelt in Jerusalem to give a portion of the priests and the Levites, that they might be encouraged in the law of God. So we find, as soon as the commandment came abroad, the children of Israel brought in abundance, the first fruits, corn, wine, oil, honey, and all the increase of the field, and the tithe, all things brought in abundantly. So what did Israel do? God turned them. How did God deal with the congregation of Israel, bring them to repentance? First, he turned them back to the knowledge of his festivals. And they observed the festival. And then they proceeded to put in action in their lives the lesson of the days of unleavened bread. They began to go out and destroy the idols. They began to cut. See, that's a part of bringing forth the evidence of repentance. To faithfully observe God's festivals. To get rid of the idols. To begin to tithe to God. And so we find, verse 20, thus did Hezekiah throughout all Judah, and wrought that which was good and right and truth before the eternal God, and in every work that he brought began in the service of the house of God, and in the law and in the commandments, to seek his God. He did it with all his heart and prospered. You could go on, we could go through the story of Hezekiah and how he became sick, and he trusted God for his healing, and he was healed and raised up, and how the Assyrian armies, having poured down from northern Israel into Jerusalem, or into Judea, surrounded Jerusalem, having conquered all of Judea, and how Hezekiah, instead of trying to institute the draft and get a big army, how he simply took the letter that the king of Assyria had written, laid it out, went into the temple, laid it out before God, and said, "Oh God in heaven, you see what this king has said. You see how he's telling you. I call on you, the great God of the universe, to intervene and to avenge your people." And God sent an angel from heaven and destroyed the Assyrian army, wiped out a tremendous army of over 100,000 men, to where only the king was left. You can go through the story here in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, and also back in 2 Kings. How that in chapter 19, that there were actually 185,000 Syrian soldiers that were slain in that one night by the angel of God, and actually that was on Passover several years later. So Hezekiah turned to God with all his heart. And the way he began was to clean up the temple, to begin to reinstitute the observance of God's festival, to exhort the people to get rid of the idols, to begin to tithe, to exhort the ministry of God, the priests and the Levites, to stand firm in the law of God. And God intervened for Hezekiah, delivered him, healed him, delivered the nation. And the Israelites, those few that heard the word and repented and came to Jerusalem and were at the right place at the right time, were preserved, because while they were gone, the Assyrians poured in to northern Israel and carried the rest of the Israelites captive. And those who were in Jerusalem keeping the feast stayed, protected. Those who had laughed them to scorn and stayed in northern Israel wound up besieged and taken into Assyria as captives. observe God's festivals were protected by God. They turned to God with their heart, and they walked with God. And God preserved that generation alive. But then in the aftermath of that, again, the people grew lax, and they grew familiar. And then through the reign of Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah, the temple was shut up. And the people ceased to obey God and to serve God and to keep His commandments. And then a period of about 50 years later, a whole generation later, we read in 2 Chronicles 34. There was a little boy that became king by the name of Josiah. He was 8 years old. 2 Chronicles 34:1. He began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Eternal. And he walked in the ways of David his father, and declined neither to the right hand nor to the left. In the 8th year of his reign, while he was yet young, he was only 16 at that time, he began to seek God, the God of David his father. And in the 12th year, when he was 20 and assumed full power as king, you see up until age 20, there was a council of regency that would exercise power. But Josiah, at age 16, really began to seek God, began to study God's Word, and began to really try to obey God. And actually the man that was the teacher, his teacher was the high priest, Hilkiah. If you go back to the book of Jeremiah, you'll find that it was actually Jeremiah's father. Jeremiah, as a young teenager, about 3 or 4 years younger than Josiah, you know, we think of God's servants as all being up in years, and yet the greatest period of revival the nation of Judah ever experienced was during the reign of King Josiah when he was 21 and Jeremiah was 17. God's king and God's prophet. And they literally turned the nation upside down for a generation. Now he began to seek God. And what is the first thing he did? Verse 4. They broke down the altars of Baal in his presence, and the images that were on the high places. That were high above them. He cut down the groves and the carved images and the molten images. He broke in pieces and made dust of them. And strode them on the graves of them and sacrificed upon them. So he just went through. The first thing he began to do was to purge out all the idols out of the way. And then he gave instruction. He gathered up money and instructed that they begin to repair the house of God. And in verse 9, when they came to Hilkiah, the high priest, they delivered the money that was brought into the house of God, which the Levites had kept. They kept the doors that gathered of the hand of Ephraim and Manasseh and all the remnant of Israel and all Judah and Benjamin, and they returned to Jerusalem. And they put it in the hand of the workmen that had the oversight of the house of God, gave it to the workmen that walked in the house of the Eternal to repair and to amend the house. So they began to clean up the temple, to repair the temple. In verse 14, when they brought out the money that was brought into the house of the Eternal, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Eternal given by Moses. So they actually rediscovered the book of the law, the Bible, that was buried back in the back of the temple. And so they had not really had access to it. The priests had not been teaching out of it. They brought in the book of the law. They brought it in and read it before Josiah. And when he heard it, he rent his garments. He realized they were in worse trouble than he thought. Because, of course, they went through and they read the curses of Leviticus 26. And he went through and realized what they stood in danger of actually going into captivity because of the things that God had prophesied for the transgression of the covenant. So Josiah turned to God and began to seek God. And because of that, God said that he would spare Judah and Jerusalem during Josiah's lifetime. In chapter 35, verse 1, moreover, Josiah kept the Passover under the Eternal in Jerusalem, and they killed the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. And he set the priests in their charges and encouraged them to the service of the Eternal. And he goes through and describes the Passover. Verse 17, the children of Israel that were present kept the Passover at that time and the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days. Verse 18, and there was no Passover like to that kept in Israel from the days of Samuel the prophet. Neither did all the kings of Israel keep such a Passover as Josiah kept, and the priests and the Levites and all Judah and Israel that were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now, Josiah's Passover, we're told, was the greatest Passover since the days of Samuel the prophet. A period of almost 400 years by this time. Now, the reason Josiah's Passover was considered an even greater event than Hezekiah's great Passover was that Josiah's Passover was actually kept Hezekiah, because of the cleansing of the temple, because of the whole situation, had to observe the second Passover. That was the great Passover revival. It was actually what is termed the second Passover during the reign of Hezekiah. So during the reign of Josiah, when they observed this great Passover, the time of revival and restoration and restitution, it was at the time really that God wanted it done. Of course, God allowed the other as had made provision for it in the law, but it was an even greater event, a more significant event. It was the first time since the days of Samuel that the Passover had been kept with that type of an attitude and spirit, with that wholeheartedness, on the first month, the 14th day of the first month. So here was a tremendous turning around of the nation, this Passover. And yet, as we go on through the rest of the story, we find that Josiah died, and that Judah as a whole turned back to the ways that they had supposedly forsaken, and within a matter of 4 years after Josiah's death, Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon invaded, and God's opportunity to the people had ceased. And God allowed them to be taken into captivity beginning in 604 BC and for a period of about 35 years, something like that. Over that period of time, they were transported out. So, or about 20 years rather, that they were actually 3 different invasions of the Babylonians. So, we find here that God's festivals played a major role in the revival and the restoration of the law of God. When the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon, and they were there over a period of 70 years, and then they were finally allowed to return again. The festivals played a major role in the revival that took place. We can read, for instance, back in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8, as Israel was regathered, or the Jews, not actually Israel, but the Jews, the house of Judah was regathered from Babylon. Because of their disobedience to God and their transgression of God's law, they were regathered, and they learned a certain lesson. In chapter 8, verse 1, all the people gathered themselves together as one man in the street. It was before the water gate, and they spoke unto Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Eternal had commanded to Israel. And Ezra the priest brought the law before the congregation, both men and women, and all that could hear with understanding upon the first day of the 7th month. That's the Feast of Trumpets. And he read therein before the street and before the water gate from morning till midday. And they were attentive unto the book of the law, and he stood upon a pulpit of wood, which they had made for that purpose, very similarly to the way that we do today. And he spoke and expounded the book of the law, verse 8. They read the book in the law of God distinctly and gave the sense and caused them to understand the reading. In other words, just as God's ministers do today, they read and they expounded and explained what the law meant. So, verse 16, the people went forth and brought them and made themselves food. See, here it comes to the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. And everyone upon the roof of his house and in their courts and in the courts of the house of God, in the street of the water gate, and the street of the gate of Ephraim. And all the congregation of them that were come out of the captivity made booths and sat under booths. For since the days of Joshua the son of Nun, unto that day, had not the children of Israel done so, and there was very great gladness. The latter part of verse 18, they kept the feast 7 days, and on the 8th day was a solemn assembly according to the manner. Here was a time of Feast of Tabernacles that we're told was the greatest Feast of Tabernacles, kept more closely to the exact instructions God had given. It was the first time since the days of Joshua that the Feast of Tabernacles had been kept just exactly the way that God wanted it kept, wholeheartedly by the people. Since the days of Joshua, brethren, do you realize you're talking of a period of over 800 years? God gave to the congregation of Israel his festivals to to remind Israel, to remind the congregation, to remind the church of his plan, of the purpose that he was working out. And as the church kept mindful of the festivals of God and observed God's festivals with a whole heart, they obeyed the rest of the law and they received the blessings of God. As the congregation lost sight of the festivals and the importance of the festivals, they lost sight of the importance of obeying the rest of the law of God. They lost sight of the plan and the purpose that God was working out. And they began to depart. We can go back to the New Testament, and I see I don't have time to go through all that I have intended, but that's okay. We should continue at a later date. Well, we find the very specific instructions back in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 6. Paul writes to the church at Corinth, the church of God, the New Testament church. And remember, Corinth was a city in Greece. He was writing primarily to Gentile people. Writing to a church in Greece. He was not writing to the church in Jerusalem. And he said in 1 Corinthians 5:6, your glorying is not good. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Well, you ladies, when you make bread, how much leavening do you put in? You put in a cup of yeast for every cup of flour? You'd have a mess if you did, wouldn't you? Can you imagine? It doesn't take much, does it? A little bit. Just a little bit of yeast, a little bit of baking soda or baking powder. When you're going to, make bread. A little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. Purge out, therefore, the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us, therefore let us keep the feast. Not with all leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now I want to emphasize one particular point here. People want to know if there's a New Testament command to keep the feast. Yes, there is. Here it is. How plain can you get? Let us keep the feast. Plain enough? I mean, how specific can you get? Now, let's notice something. In verse 7, it says, purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. Now let me ask you a question. How many different ways can you be unleavened? There are only two that I can think of. If you know of another, let me know. There's only two ways that you can be unleavened. You can be unleavened physically, or you can be unleavened spiritually. Now, is there another way of being unleavened? Either you're speaking of being unleavened physically, or you're speaking of being unleavened spiritually. Is there something else besides physical and spiritual? I think that pretty well sums up everything, doesn't it? Alright, now let's ask ourselves the question. Paul told the Corinthian church that they were unleavened. He said, purge out the old leaven, you may be a new one, as you are unleavened. Now, was he only speaking spiritually? See, some people like to read this and they want to spiritualize away the law. They say, well, yeah, he wasn't talking about literally going out and putting out, leavening out of your home. He just meant, that they just kind of had all these good thoughts in their heart. And they were unleavened spiritually. Well, let us ask ourselves the question, were the people in the Corinthian church spiritually unleavened? The answer is in verse 2 of chapter 5. And you are puffed up, and have not rather mourned, that he that has done his deeds might be taken away from among you. What was their spiritual condition? Spiritually, they were puffed up. Spiritually, they were leavened. Right? Is that what he says in verse 2? Therefore, there was only one way that they could be unleavened. Since they obviously were not spiritually unleavened, they therefore were physically unleavened. Now, did Paul say, what in the world are you Gentiles doing keeping those Jewish days? Go out and buy you a loaf of bread, and go down to McDonald's and get a hamburger, and forget about all that stuff. Is that what he told them? No. He said, look, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Purge out therefore the old leaven, that you in your life life may be a new look as you are unleavened. You need to unleaven spiritually in the same way that you have already unleavened physically. He's saying you have to go beyond just the physical. You've got to unleaven your lives as well as your homes. For even Christ, our Passover, sacrifice for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven. You cannot keep the feast of unleavened bread with your old leaven. Your baking powder and your bread and all that type of thing. Neither can you keep it with the leaven of malice and wickedness. You see, very, very plain. He said, no more than you can keep the feast of unleavened bread with leaven, physically. Neither can you keep it with the leaven of malice and wickedness. You have to understand the spiritual implications. But with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So there is very plainly a New Testament command to observe the feast of unleavened bread. To observe God's festivals. You know, it's an interesting thing. I don't know, well, we'll do that. We don't have time. I want to point out something to you in the book of John. I could spend the whole sermon on it, but I'm going to summarize it and perhaps have a chance to cover it in detail at a later time. Let me just introduce the subject by saying, John was the last of the apostles to write. There are 27 books in the New Testament. The first 22 had been completed and compiled by the latter 60s AD. Peter makes specific reference to that in 2 Peter. You can go back and read it in 2 Peter chapter 2, where he talks about the fact that he and John had a specific commission from Christ, that they had the sure word promise. He said, I'll just paraphrase, but you can go back and check it. He said, we were with him in the Holy Mount. We heard the voice from heaven saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, hear you him. We have the more sure word of promise. This is in 2 Peter 2. Now, who was with Christ in the Holy Mount that heard the voice of God saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased? Well, if you go back to Matthew 17, you will find that Christ took Peter, James, and John apart, went into the mountain, was transfigured there before them, and the voice of God came and said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So there were only 3 that heard that voice. Now, as you go to the book of Acts, you find that James was the first of the 12 apostles to be martyred. Back around Acts chapter 1, about Acts chapter 12, wasn't it? So that left only Peter and John. So when Peter used the term we, in 2 Peter 2, referring to we were with him in the Holy Mountain, we heard the voice, we have a more sure word of prophecy. The we could only mean Peter and John. There were only 2 individuals left who had heard the voice of God speak there in the mountain in Christ's transfigured. They had the sure word of prophecy. They were the ones that had the responsibility of compiling the New Testament. See, who decided which books were inspired and not the ones who had the sure word of prophecy? Peter and John. Peter compiled the first 22 books. That leaves 5 out. Those are the 5 books John wrote. The Gospel of John, the books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Revelation, which were added about 30 years later. See, the first group was compiled by Peter right prior to his death. He alludes to it in 2 Peter, which was written about 67 or 68 AD. Then, 30 years later, John wrote the Gospel of John, the 3 epistles of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Revelation, at a time when the false church was rising into the ascendancy and when Rome stood on the threshold of what became the Catholic Church emerging into full view. There was already an attempt to get away from the commandments of God, and particularly the festivals of God and the Sabbath. Now, have you ever asked yourself the question, after 3 gospel accounts had already been written, why would John 30 years later sit down and write another? Now, if you go through and compare the Gospel of John with the other accounts, you will find there is a great difference. John deals almost entirely in the Gospel of John with 7 days in the life of Christ. That's it. They're just connected verses tying it together. Primarily, the entire Gospel of John. The Gospel of John deals with what Christ taught on 7 distinct festivals during his lifetime. That's what the whole Gospel of John is about. It's the New Testament exposition of the festivals. Written 30 years after the church in Jerusalem had scattered, you see. 30 years after Jerusalem had been destroyed, 30 years after all the rest of the apostles were dead, at a time when the keeping of the commandments of God was being undermined, was being disparaged. Let's just notice very briefly. John chapter 1 sets the stage, introduces us to Christ into the calling of the 12. In chapter 2, the beginning of the chapter, we have the water to wine. In verse 13, Jews' Passover was at hand. So in chapter 2, verse 13, we're introduced to the Passover. This is the occasion. We go through and we have Christ coming into Jerusalem, and we have Christ cleansing the temple. Now what do we do? Right? What is the life of the Passover? What do we do right prior to the Passover? What do? You clean up your house, don't you? You unleaven your house. What did Christ do? He went into his Father's house and unleavened the house. He cast out the money changers and all the ones that were doing it. He said, you get out of my Father's house. My Father's house is to be a house of prayer, and you make it a den of thieves. So he spiritually unleavened the temple, didn't he? And he expounded right there in the context of the first Passover of his ministry. Now, as we go on, and then into chapter 3, he expounds to Nicodemus about being born again. He talks to him on down in the famous verse, chapter 3 of John 3:16. God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. Whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son to the world to condemn the world through him might be saved. That's the message of the Passover, isn't it? Christ, our Passover sacrifice for us. Christ is here during the days of unleavened bread. That's when he talked to Nicodemus, expounding the spiritual meaning of the Passover. Now as we continue on down in chapter 4, after this time, he was on his way through Samaria back up to Galilee. And we find him confronting the woman at the well in Samaria. Now, what was the time period? The time period was immediately prior to the day of Pentecost, just before Pentecost. And that can be demonstrated in verse 35 of John 4. Say you not, there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest. Behold, I say, if you lift up your eyes and look on the field, they are white already for harvest. Now, the harvest was the 7th month, beginning of the 7th month. 4 months previous would be the beginning of the 3rd month. Pentecost always comes in the first week of the 3rd month. Oh. So he was speaking here at the Pentecost season. And what did he do? He instructed her. What did he tell the woman at the well? Verse 24, God is a spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. What did he say in verse 14? Whosoever drinks of this water that I give him shall never thirst. The water that I give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into eternal life. He talked about the Holy Spirit. See, on the time of Pentecost. Now, as we come on down, chapter 5, verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, here he is in a particular festival. Now, it does not specifically mention what festival it was, but as we go through chapter 5, it becomes apparent. Jesus said, verse 21, as the Father raises up the dead and quickens them, even so the Son quickens whom he will. The Father judges no man, he's committed all judgment unto the Son. Verse 25, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God, and they that hear shall live. Verse 28, marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, in which all that are in the grave shall hear his voice, and shall come forth. He's talking of, here he is at the time of the Feast of Trumpets, and he's expounding about the resurrection, and about the time that when he's going to return to judge the world, and when the dead are going to be resurrected. So here he is going through expounding the meaning of the Feast of Trumpets. And then in chapter 6, verse 4, the Passover, Feast of the Jews, was near. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and he saw the multitude, and we go through with the lesson of the loaves and the fishes. When Jesus Christ expounded in verse 35, he said unto them, I am the bread of life. Now we go through some things, Passover, and we talk about how the bread symbolizes Christ's broken body, broken for us. He goes through and expounds that in John 6. Verse 51, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Verse 48, I am that bread of life. He's going through, this is during the days of unleavened bread. He's talking about bread. He's talking about bread. He's talking about the bread of life. He's talking about imbibing him. This is we imbibe unleavened bread. that symbolizes, taking in Jesus Christ, who is the epitome of sincerity and truth. All right? There is we've gone through Passover, Pentecost, trumpets, and another feast of unleavened bread. Now we come to chapter 7 to the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 2, the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. So we find, verse 14, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. And in verse 19, he said, Moses gave you the law, yet now you keep the law. In verse 24, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. This is during the Feast of Tabernacles. What does the Feast of Tabernacles picture? It pictures the time when the saints are going to rule and judge the world under Jesus Christ. We're not going to judge according to the appearance, we're going to judge righteous judgment. Now in verse 37, in the last day, that great day of the feast. Now we come to the last great day. So we've been through a Passover, a Pentecost, trumpets, another Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Tabernacles. Now we come to the last great day, sixth festival mentioned, and Christ begins to speak of the time, if any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. See, right now, no man can come unto the Father except the Spirit, and no man can come to the Son except the Spirit of the Father draw him. But on the last great day, if any man thirst, he'll be able to come and drink. All will be called at that time. And he went through and spoke about the time when the Holy Spirit was going to be given to all mankind during the time of the last great day. And as you proceed on, as you just go right on, this was the evening portion that began the last great day. Chapter 8, verse 1, Jesus went into the Mount of Olives, or verse 53 of chapter 7. Every man went into his own house. Next verse, Jesus went into the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again to the temple. This is the daylight portion of the last great day. And as you go down through chapter 8, if you just read chapter 8, 9, 10, consecutively, if you just go down through it, you will find that all of the events of chapter 8, 9, and 10 occurred on the same day. The daylight portion of the last great day, you just have to read it down consecutively. Christ removed blindness from the man who was blind, just as he's spiritually going to remove blindness from the eyes of all people at the time of the last great day. The woman taken in adultery was brought to him for judgment, and how did he deal with her? He dealt with her the same way he will deal with all mankind when they come before him at the time of the last great day. He will say to them as they stand there under sentence of death, go and sin no more. Goes through and expounds the spiritual meaning. Then, as you go all the way down through chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10, he brings out even down in verse 14, I am the good shepherd, know my sheep, and am known of mine. We're his sheep now, see, sheep of his pasture. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep, and other sheep I have which are not of this fold. See, ultimately, all of mankind is going to be called at the time of the last great day. Then also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. That'll be accomplished at the time of the last great day. So Christ, expounds, and John records it for us all the way through. Then, in chapter 11, verse 55, and the Jews' Passover was near at hand. That brings us to the seventh festival, and the rest of the book of John, the rest of chapter 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, deals with the last Passover of the life of Jesus Christ, focusing in on detail. John spent the whole gospel account going through the teachings of Christ on 7 festival occasions, preserving for the church the record of the spiritual amplification of each of the festivals. So we're very clear as we go through the festivals. We see that number one, the festivals were given when the church was instituted. Given to teach the church the plan that God has for it. We find that the festivals played a major role in revival and restoration of the law and of the truth of God in the congregation, in the church, throughout the Old Testament period. And the only time the people were close to God and received God's blessing and were walking with God was when they turned with their whole heart to God, and they did it in the context of the festival. We find in the New Testament there is a very specific commandment to us today to keep the feast. We find that the command that Jesus Christ kept the festivals in John writing over 60 years after Jesus Christ had been crucified, resurrected, and ascended into heaven, emphasized to the church that the festivals were to be kept. Now, it is an interesting thing. As we go through the book of John, we find the emphasis on the church, on Christ's teaching on the fact. John died in Ephesus, there in northern Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. We find a generation later, after the death of the Apostle John, there was a controversy that arose that is preserved for us in a book called Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History. He was a Catholic historian that was a contemporary of the Emperor Constantine, who made the Catholic religion the official religion of the Roman Empire. And Eusebius writes an interesting story. Speaking of about 60 years after John's death, there was a considerable discussion raised about this time in consequence of a difference of opinion respecting the observance of the Paschal season, the time of Passover. The Easter and Passover normally come right around the same time. The churches of all Asia, speaking of Ephesus, speaking of the area where John lived and died in the final years, all of the book of Revelation written to the 7 churches of Asia, see, that's where John was. That's the specific area he spent the last years of his life. That's the area where he wrote the Gospel of John. The churches of all Asia, where the churches Paul had raised up, the church where Timothy was, the church where John was, guided by a remoter tradition, suppose that they ought to keep the 14th day of the moon for the festival of the Savior's Passover, in which day the Jews were commanded to kill the Paschal lamb. So there were various synods and convocations for our bishops on this day. And they were very upset. The bishop of Rome tried to get the churches of Asia to turn away, and they refused to do so. And so then we come to a period of about 50 years later. The bishops, however, of Asia, persevering in observing the custom handed down to them from their fathers, were headed by Polycrates. He was the leader of the church in Ephesus during a period of about 150 AD to 200 AD. In other words, he took over about 50 years after John died. Now, the bishops of Asia persevered in observing the custom handed down to them from their fathers, were headed by Polycrates. He indeed had also set forth the tradition handed down to him in a letter which he addressed to Victor in the Church of Rome. Here's what Polycrates said. He was the leader of God's true church there in the area of Asia, the area of the churches that John had spent his last years in. We, therefore, observe the genuine day, neither adding thereto nor taking therefrom. For in Asia great lights have fallen asleep, which shall rise again in the day of the Lord's appearing. So he didn't believe in going to heaven. He understood, they were asleep and they were going to rise when Christ returned, in which he will come with glory from heaven and will raise up all the saints. Philip, one of the 12 apostles who sleeps in Hierapolis, John, who rested upon the bosom of our Lord, Polycarp of Smyrna, both bishop and martyr. And he goes through and he mentions various names, who now rests at Sardis, awaiting the visitation from heaven, the return of Christ, when he shall rise from the dead. All these observe the 14th day of the Passover according to the gospel, deviating in no respect but following the rule of faith. Moreover, I, Polycrates, who am least of all of you according to the tradition of my relatives, some of whom I followed, for there were 7 of my relatives bishops and I am the 8th, and my relatives always observed the day when the people threw away the rest. Specific text. I therefore